The August night hung over Willowbrook Plantation like a burial shroud, thick with moisture, and the cloying scent of magnolia that couldn't quite mask the copper tang of blood. In the master bedroom of the great house, Seraphina Moss pressed, her dark fingers against Cordelia Ashworth's fevered belly, feeling for the child that had stopped moving 3 hours ago. The mistress's screams had long since faded to whimpers, her blonde hair plastered to her skull with sweat, her pale hands clutching at the imported French linens as another contraction seized her body. "Push now, Mistress Ashworth," Seraphina commanded, her voice carrying the authority that had made her the most sought-after midwife in Carleton County. White folks from as far as Walterboro requested her specifically, willing to pay Jeremiah Ashworth handsomely for the loan of his property. They trusted her completely, these plantation wives with their soft bodies and softer lives. They looked into her eyes and saw devotion, competence, salvation. They never saw the truth. The candles flickered in their silver holders, casting writhing shadows across the wallpaper's delicate pattern of climbing roses. Outside, a screech owl called 3 times, an omen that would have sent the field hands to their knees in prayer. But Seraphina had long since stopped believing in omens. She believed only in the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat and the terrible purpose that drove it. Cordelia Ashworth bore down with what little strength remained in her 23-year-old body, her face contorting into something primitive and desperate. This was her first child after 4 years of marriage, 4 years of monthly disappointments and whispered speculation about her fitness as a wife. The entire county knew how desperately she wanted this baby, how she'd spent months confined to her bed on doctor's orders, taking every tonic and following every superstition to ensure a healthy birth. Seraphina's hands moved with practiced precision, guiding, coaxing, her face a mask of concentrated concern. She had delivered over 100 babies in her 34 years, first learning at her grandmother's side back at the Thistledown estate in Georgia, then perfecting her craft here in South Carolina. The white folks spoke of her gifted hands, her intuitive understanding of the birthing process, the way she could turn a breech baby or ease the most difficult labor. What they didn't speak of, what they couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge, was the recent string of tragedies. 4 stillbirths in the past 18 months, all of them white babies, all of them delivered by Seraphina's capable hands. Each time, the families mourned and moved on, accepting God's will with the fatalism of those who lived surrounded by death. Yellow fever, consumption, childbed fever. Death was as common as morning glory in the Carolina Lowcountry. "I can see the head, mistress," Seraphina announced, though what she saw made her stomach tighten with familiar anticipation. The baby was positioned perfectly, just as she had ensured with subtle manipulations throughout the labor. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Behind her, Temperance stood ready with clean linens and warm water, the 15-year-old housemaid's eyes wide with barely concealed fear. She had assisted Seraphina before, had seen 2 of the previous stillbirths, and though she never spoke of it, Seraphina could feel the girl's growing suspicion like a cold breath on her neck. "Is my baby all right?" Cordelia gasped between contractions, her blue eyes wild with pain and hope. "Why isn't it crying? Babies should cry, shouldn't they?" "Not all babies cry right away, mistress," Seraphina replied smoothly, her hands working with deadly efficiency beneath the blood-soaked sheets. "You just focus on pushing. Let old Seraphina handle the rest." Old Seraphina. That's what they called her, though she was younger than many of the women she attended. It was the gray threading through her hair, premature silver that had appeared the day she learned of Delilah's fate. Her baby girl, sold away at 7 years old to a rice plantation near Georgetown, dead within 6 months. Worked to death, the whispered report said. Fever, the official story claimed. Murder, Seraphina's heart knew. The final push came with a gush of blood and fluid, and Seraphina caught the infant with steady hands. A boy, perfectly formed, with his father's strong jaw already evident in his tiny face. For a moment, just a heartbeat, he was alive. She could feel the pulse beneath her fingers, could see the potential for breath in his small chest. Then her thumb found the spot at the base of his skull, the place her grandmother had shown her long ago when teaching her to ease the suffering of barn cats born too weak to survive. A gentle pressure, barely noticeable, disguised by the normal motions of cleaning the baby's face and clearing his airways. The infant's limbs went slack, his potential extinguished like a candle flame between wet fingers. "Let me see him," Cordelia cried, trying to rise despite her exhaustion. "Why isn't he crying? Seraphina, why isn't my baby crying?" Seraphina turned slowly, cradling the still form wrapped in the finest cotton. Her face had arranged itself into lines of profound sorrow, an expression she had practiced in the cracked mirror in her cabin until it became second nature. Tears, real tears, for she had learned to summon them at will by thinking of Delilah's laugh, rolled down her dark cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Mistress Ashworth," she whispered, each word weighted with perfectly calibrated grief. "The Lord has called him home before he could draw breath. There was nothing that could be done." The wail that erupted from Cordelia Ashworth's throat could have woken the dead, but it wouldn't wake her son. It echoed through the great house, bringing Jeremiah Ashworth racing up the stairs, his boots thundering against the polished wood. He burst through the door, his face flushed with bourbon and expectation, only to have it drain to ash at the sight of his wife sobbing over the still bundle in her arms. "No," he said, the word flat and disbelieving. "No, this cannot be. You said she was the best. Everyone said Seraphina was the best. Sometimes, Master Ashworth," Seraphina said quietly, keeping her eyes appropriately downcast. "The Lord's will cannot be denied, no matter how skilled the hands that serve him." She stayed another hour, tending to Cordelia, cleaning the afterbirth, ensuring no hemorrhage would claim the mother as well as the child. Her movements were gentle, professional, above any suspicion. When Dr. Blackwood arrived from Columbia the next morning, he would find nothing amiss. A tragedy, certainly, but a natural one. These things happened, especially in the suffocating heat of August. As Seraphina finally made her way back to the slave quarters, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. The other slaves were already stirring, preparing for another day in the cotton fields, but they gave her a wide berth. They always did after she returned from a birthing, whether successful or not. There was something about her that had changed in the past 18 months, something that made even the bravest field hand look away when she passed. She entered her small cabin and closed the door behind her, finally allowing her mask to slip. In the dim light filtering through the single window, she reached beneath her straw mattress and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages filled with her careful script. She added a single line, August 15, 1855, Jeremiah and Cordelia Ashworth, a son, stillborn. 5 names now. 5 small acts of vengeance for Delilah. 5 white mothers who would know even a fraction of the agony that consumed her every waking moment. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. As she lay down on her narrow bed, still wearing her blood-stained dress, Seraphina began to plan. The Fairweather Plantation was expecting a birth next month, and then the Beauregard family, in October. Her reputation, paradoxically, had only grown with each tragedy. People assumed that she was called to the most difficult cases, that the stillbirths would have happened regardless of who attended them. They trusted her. They needed her. And that trust would be their undoing. If you're captivated by this chilling tale of vengeance and survival in the antebellum South, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support helps bring more historical horror stories to life. Let me know in the comments what you think of Seraphina's dark justice. Is she a villain or a victim? Keep watching as her story unfolds. The memory came to Seraphina in the quiet hours before dawn. 3 years distant but sharp as broken glass, she had arrived at Willowbrook Plantation in the winter of 1852, shackled in the back of a wagon with 2 other women from the Thistledown estate sale. The Georgia cold had bitten through her thin dress, but it was nothing compared to the ice that had formed around her heart the day they took Delilah away. Her daughter had been 7 years old, all knobby knees and wild hair that refused to be tamed no matter how much bear grease Seraphina worked through it. Delilah had her father's eyes, Not that anyone at Thistledown would acknowledge that particular truth about Master Whitmore's visits to the quarters. Hazel green that caught the light like creek water in sunshine. Those eyes had looked back at Seraphina from the slave trader's wagon, wide with confusion and terror, as the distance between them grew infinite. "Mama will find you," Seraphina had called out, her voice breaking on the promise. "Mama will always find you, baby girl." But she hadn't. She had tried. Lord knows she had tried, following every whisper and rumor about a light-skinned girl sold to the Georgetown rice plantations. It had taken 8 months for the truth to reach her through the underground network of slaves who carried news between plantations like blood through veins. Delilah had lasted only 6 months at the Riverside plantation. The overseer, a man named Cornelius Dretch, had worked with her in the rice fields despite her young age. When fever season came, she was too weak to fight it off. That was the story they told. But Seraphina had learned more from a field hand named Moses, who had escaped Riverside and been caught near Willowbrook. Before they hanged him for running, he had whispered the truth to her through the bars of the punishment shed. Delilah hadn't died of fever. She had tried to run back to her mother and had made it 3 miles before the dogs caught her. The overseer had made an example of her to the other children. Seraphina rose from her narrow bed in the pre-dawn darkness of the present, pushing the memory aside with practiced determination. The quarters were already stirring with the sounds of another day's burden beginning. Through her single window she could see the cooking fires being lit, shadows moving between the roughly built cabins that housed Willowbrook's 130 slaves. A soft knock at her door interrupted her morning preparations. She opened it to find Hespera, the plantation's elderly cook, standing in the dim light with a cup of chicory coffee, a rare luxury in the quarters. "Figured you could use this after last night," Hespera said, her knowing eyes studying Seraphina's face. The old woman had been at Willowbrook for 40 years, and had seen 3 generations of Ashworths come into the world. She had also seen the change in Seraphina over the past 18 months, watched the light die in her eyes and something else take its place. "That's kind of you, Aunt Hespera," Seraphina replied, accepting the cup. The older slaves were called aunt or uncle out of respect, though Hespera commanded more than just respect. She commanded a certain careful fear. "Another tragedy for the mistress," Hespera continued, not moving from the doorway. "5th one you've attended that ended poorly. People are starting to notice." "Babies die," Seraphina said flatly, meeting the older woman's gaze without flinching. "White babies, black babies, they all die sometimes. It's God's will." "Is it now?" Hespera's voice carried layers of meaning, like sediment in river water. "And here I thought God's will usually involved crying and breathing and such." The 2 women stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken truth hanging between them like morning mist. Finally, Hespera stepped back, but not before placing a gnarled hand on Seraphina's arm. "Be careful, child," she whispered. "The dead have a way of dragging the living down with them, and you're carrying enough ghosts for 10 women. After Hespera left, Seraphina made her way to the herb garden behind the kitchen, a small plot that Jeremiah Ashworth had granted her permission to tend. The white folks believed it was for healing tinctures and teas, and indeed many of the plants served that purpose. But hidden among the feverfew and chamomile were other things: pennyroyal, tansy, cotton root bark. Plants her grandmother had taught her about. Plants that could ease a pregnancy or end one. Plants that could slow a heart or stop it entirely if one knew the proper doses. She was gathering lavender when Temperance appeared at her elbow, moving, with the quiet grace that made her valuable in the big house. The girl had been born at Willowbrook, had never known any other life. But there was intelligence in her dark eyes that reminded Seraphina painfully of Delilah. "Master Ashworth wants to see you," Temperance said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "He's in his study with that doctor from Columbia, the one with the gold spectacles." Seraphina's hands stilled on the lavender stems. Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood had been making rounds of the plantations for the past month, supposedly researching yellow fever patterns. But she had heard whispers that he had other interests, specifically the unusual number of stillbirths among the plantation class. Thank you, child, Seraphina said, straightening slowly. You go back to the house now. But Temperance didn't move. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. I know what you do, she said, the words falling like stones into still water. I've watched you, the way your hands move when you think no one's looking, the way those babies are perfect until... She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Seraphina turned to face the girl fully, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she considered the weight of what would need to be done if Temperance proved to be a threat. The girl was young, trusting. It would be easy to arrange an accident, a fall down the stairs perhaps, or a sudden illness from spoiled food. What you think you know, Seraphina said carefully, could get us both whipped to death or worse. Sometimes, child, it's better to see nothing, know nothing, say nothing. Temperance nodded slowly, but her eyes remained troubled. My mama died birthing my baby brother, she said quietly. He lived 3 days before the fever took him. Mistress, Ashworth's baby. He looked stronger than my brother ever did. Death doesn't always announce itself with weakness, Seraphina replied. Now go on, before they wonder what's keeping you. As she made her way to the big house, Seraphina thought about the first white child she had delivered at Willowbrook, the Cunningham baby from the neighboring plantation. She had saved that child, turned it from breech position with skill that had made her reputation throughout the county. The mother had wept with gratitude, had given Seraphina a silver thimble as a gift, not knowing that Seraphina couldn't legally own property. That was before she learned about Delilah. Before Moses whispered the truth through the bars of the punishment shed. Before she understood that the only currency that mattered in this world was pain, and the only justice was the kind you carved out with your own hands. The study door was open when she arrived, and she could hear male voices within. Jeremiah Ashworth's bourbon-roughened drawl and another voice, cultured and precise, that must belong to Dr. Blackwood. She knocked on the doorframe and entered when bid, keeping her eyes appropriately downcast. Ah, Seraphina, Master Ashworth said, though his usual jovial tone was notably absent. Dr. Blackwood here has some questions about last night's unfortunate event. She raised her eyes enough to take in the doctor, a thin man in his 40s, with prematurely white hair and gold-rimmed spectacles that caught the morning light. His suit was immaculate despite the heat, and his pale hands were perfectly manicured. But it was his eyes that made her internal alarm sound. Intelligent, calculating, missing nothing. I understand you've attended quite a number of births that have ended in stillbirth, Dr. Blackwood said without preamble. 5 in the past 18 months, if my information is correct. Yes, sir, Seraphina replied simply. It grieves me each time. I'm sure it does, the doctor said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Tell me, what do you believe accounts for this unusual pattern? The Lord works in mysterious ways, sir, she said, falling back on the religious platitudes that whites expected from slaves. Perhaps it's the heat or the water or some sickness we don't understand. Dr. Blackwood stood and circled her slowly like a hawk evaluating prey. You were trained by your grandmother, I understand, at the Thistledown estate in Georgia. Yes, sir. She delivered 3 generations of babies before she passed. And did she teach you about herbs? About the properties of certain plants? Seraphina felt the trap closing but kept her expression neutral. She taught me healing herbs, sir, for easing pain and bringing down fever. Nothing else? What else would a slave need to know, sir? The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Finally, Dr. Blackwood returned to his seat, pulling out a small notebook and making notes with a silver pen. I'll be staying in the area for several weeks, he announced. I've asked Mr. Ashworth to inform me immediately of any impending births. I would like to observe your methods firsthand. Of course, sir, Seraphina said, though inside she felt the first real flutter of fear since she had begun her work. I'm always grateful to learn from educated folks like yourself. As she was dismissed and made her way back to the quarters, Seraphina's mind was already working through possibilities. Dr. Blackwood was a threat, but he was also an opportunity. If she could convince him that the stillbirths were natural, his authority would silence any lingering doubts. And if she couldn't, well, even doctors could suffer accidents on plantation grounds. The swamps were full of cottonmouths and copperheads, after all. That evening, as she sat in her cabin updating her journal by candlelight, she thought again of Delilah. Her daughter would have been 10 now, would have been learning to help with the household work, would have been growing into her beauty despite the ugliness of their world. Instead, she was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Georgetown County, her only monument in the growing list of names in Seraphina's journal. 5 names, 5 small revenges. But now, with Dr. Blackwood watching, the work would become more dangerous. She would need to be more careful, more clever, more patient. The next birth, Magnolia Fairweather at Cypress Grove, was only weeks away. By then, she would need a plan that could fool even a trained physician's scrutiny. She closed the journal and hid it beneath the loose floorboard where she kept her most dangerous secrets: the ground foxglove, the concentrated pokeweed extract, the other tools of her terrible trade. Tomorrow she would begin preparing, would practice her performance of devoted service until even she almost believed it. The memory of Delilah's last morning came to her again, unbidden. Her daughter laughing as she chased fireflies in the purple. Dusk, her small hands cupping light, her voice calling out, "Mama, look, I caught stars." Seraphina blew out her candle and lay in the darkness, counting the names like a rosary of revenge. 5 down. How many more before the debt was paid? How many more before she could rest? The answer came to her in Delilah's voice, carrying on the night wind through the gaps in the cabin walls. "All of them, Mama. Every last one." The September heat had settled over Colleton County like a fever that wouldn't break, and with it came Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood's peculiar brand of scientific scrutiny. He had taken up residence in the Ashworth Guest House, a small but elegant structure that sat between the main plantation house and the slave quarters, positioning himself perfectly to observe both worlds. From her herb garden, Seraphina could see his silhouette in the window at all hours, bent over his notebooks and medical texts, occasionally peering through a brass microscope he had brought from Columbia. It had been 2 weeks since Cordelia, Ashworth's stillbirth, and the doctor had made his presence felt in every corner of plantation life. He examined the water supply, tested the soil, interviewed the house slaves about their cooking methods, and most unnervingly, had begun conducting medical examinations of the pregnant women among the enslaved population. This morning, Seraphina stood beside him in the small infirmary that Jeremiah Ashworth had reluctantly established near the quarters, watching as he examined Bethany, a young field hand 7 months gone with child. The doctor's pale hands moved over Bethany's swollen belly with clinical detachment, pressing and measuring, while the woman lay rigid with fear on the examination table. "The fetal positioning seems normal," Dr. Blackwood announced, more to his notebook than to anyone present. "Heart sounds are strong. Tell me, girl, have you experienced any unusual symptoms? Bleeding? Sharp pains?" Bethany's eyes darted to Seraphina, seeking permission or reassurance. Seraphina gave an almost imperceptible nod. "No, sir," Bethany whispered. "Just the normal aches and sickness." "And you've been under Seraphina's care throughout your pregnancy?" "Yes, sir. She gives me tea for the sickness and rubs my back when it pains me." Dr. Blackwood made another note, his pen scratching against the paper like insects in the walls. "What kind of teas specifically?" Seraphina stepped forward smoothly. "Ginger root and peppermint, sir. Sometimes raspberry leaf in the final months, to ease the labor. All common remedies that my grandmother used." "Your grandmother," the doctor mused, finally looking up from his notes to fix Seraphina with those unsettling pale eyes. "She was from Haiti, was she not? Before she was brought to Georgia?" The question was a trap wrapped in scholarly curiosity. Seraphina had learned that Dr. Blackwood had been making inquiries about her background, had even written to the executor of the Thistledown estate sale. "She was born in Saint-Domingue, yes, sir, before the Revolution," Seraphina replied carefully. "But she learned her midwifery in Georgia from the plantation doctor there. He said she had natural talent." "Saint-Domingue," Dr. Blackwood repeated, savoring the words. where the slaves rose up and slaughtered their masters, where they practiced voodoo and dark arts. Tell me, did your grandmother ever speak of such things? No, sir. She was a Christian woman. Baptist like all of us here. The lie came easily, sweetened with just enough subservience to be believable. In truth, her grandmother had taught her many things that would have horrified the good Baptist. Ministers, how to read the signs in blood and bone, how to call on ancestors for guidance, how to walk the thin line between healing and harming. But most importantly, she had taught her how to hide that knowledge behind a mask of simple devotion. After dismissing Bethany, Dr. Blackwood asked Seraphina to walk with him through the plantation grounds. It was an unusual request, a white man asking for a slave's company, but nothing about Dr. Blackwood was usual. They walked in silence at first, passing the cotton fields where the slaves labored under the watching eyes of overseers, their bent backs glistening with sweat in the morning sun. I've been reviewing the records, Dr. Blackwood said finally, stopping beneath the shade of a massive live oak draped with Spanish moss. The stillbirths you've attended show a curious pattern. All were white infants. All were from prominent families. And all occurred during or shortly after the full moon. Seraphina kept her expression neutral, even as her heart began to race. She hadn't realized there was a lunar pattern. That was pure coincidence. But the doctor's observation showed how closely he was examining every detail. The full moon has always been a time of difficulty in birthing, she offered. My grandmother said it pulls on the waters in the body, just like it pulls on the tides. Superstition, Dr. Blackwood said dismissively. Though there may be some scientific basis for gravitational effects on amniotic fluid. But that doesn't explain why only white infants are affected. He turned to face her fully, and Seraphina saw something in his expression that chilled her more than any threat of violence. Genuine scientific curiosity, the kind that would dissect a living creature to understand its workings. I have a theory, he continued, pulling a small vial from his coat pocket. The liquid inside was clear with a faint green tinge. This is an extract from a plant called Digitalis purpurea, foxglove. In small doses, it can regulate the heart. In larger doses, it stops it entirely. The interesting thing is that it leaves very little trace in the body after death. Seraphina recognized the extract immediately. She had a similar preparation, hidden beneath her cabin floor, but kept her face carefully blank. I've found traces of foxglove growing wild near several of the plantations where stillbirths occurred, Dr. Blackwood continued, including here at Willowbrook. Now, it's possible. This is a coincidence, but I wonder if someone were to introduce such an extract during the birthing process, perhaps mixed with other herbs to mask its presence, could it not cause an infant's heart to stop just as it entered the world? The accusation hung between them like a blade, but Seraphina had survived too much to flinch now. Instead, she allowed confusion to cloud her features, even a touch of hurt pride. Sir, are you suggesting I would harm a baby? An innocent child? She let her voice tremble slightly. I've devoted my life to bringing life into this world. Every child I've lost haunts me. I pray for them every night. Dr. Blackwood studied her for a long moment, then smiled, a thin, cold expression that never reached his eyes. Of course not. I'm merely exploring all possibilities. Science demands we question everything, even the unthinkable. That evening, Seraphina found herself summoned to the main house for an unusual gathering. Several plantation owners from the surrounding area had come to dine with Jeremiah Ashworth and hear Dr. Blackwood present his initial findings. She was to stand in attendance, a living exhibit in the doctor's presentation. The dining room blazed with candlelight, crystal glasses catching and throwing sparkles across the wallpapered walls. The men sat around the mahogany table like judges at a tribunal. Jeremiah Ashworth, Augustus Fairweather from Cypress Grove, Mordecai Beauregard from Belle Reve, and several others whose wives had suffered losses. Gentlemen, Dr. Blackwood began, standing at the head of the table with his notes spread before him. I've spent considerable time investigating the tragic losses that have plagued our community. While I have not yet reached definitive conclusions, I have observed several interesting patterns. He went on to discuss his theories about environmental factors, dietary influences, and breeding complications, using language that reduced human reproduction to animal husbandry. The men listened with rapt attention, occasionally glancing at Seraphina where she stood against the wall like furniture. There is, however, another possibility we must consider, Dr. Blackwood continued, his voice taking on a darker tone. The historical record shows instances of servants, particularly those from certain Caribbean backgrounds, using their knowledge of herbs and poisons to commit acts of violence against their masters. The Haitian Revolution was preceded by numerous such poisonings. Augustus Fairweather shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Surely you're not suggesting that our Seraphina, she delivered 3 of my children successfully before this recent tragedy. I suggest nothing definitively, Dr. Blackwood replied. But I propose an experiment. The next birth attended by Seraphina should be closely monitored. I will observe every aspect of the process, test every substance used, and document every action taken. If the child survives, we can put these concerns to rest. If not, he didn't need to finish. The implication hung in the air like smoke from the gentleman's cigars. My wife is due next month, Augustus Fairweather said slowly. Twins, Seraphina believes. You may observe, Dr. Blackwood, but I warn you, if your presence disturbs the birthing process and harms my wife or children, I will hold you responsible. Agreed, Dr. Blackwood said with another of his cold smiles. I assure you, my presence will be purely observational. Seraphina will conduct the birth exactly as she normally would. Won't you, Seraphina? All eyes turned to her, and she felt the weight of their suspicion and need. These men who owned her body but could never touch her spirit, who trusted her with their most precious bloodlines while denying her basic humanity. Of course, sir, she said, bowing her head with practiced humility. It would be an honor to have such a learned man observe. Perhaps I might even learn something to better serve the families of this county. The meeting concluded with brandy and cigars, the men's conversation turning to cotton prices and political matters. Seraphina was dismissed, but as she walked through the darkened hallway, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Dr. Blackwood following at a discreet distance. A word of warning, Seraphina, he said quietly, his face half hidden in shadow. I know you're intelligent, far more intelligent than you pretend to be. And I know you're hiding something. I haven't yet determined what, but I will. Science is patient and methodical. It reveals all secrets eventually. The only secret I carry is grief, sir, Seraphina replied, allowing real emotion to color her words. Grief for every child I couldn't save, every mother I couldn't comfort. If that makes me suspicious in your eyes, then I accept your scrutiny. Doctor. Blackwood studied her for another long moment, then nodded slowly. We shall see. The Fairweather birth will tell us much. As Seraphina made her way back to the quarters, her mind was already working through possibilities. The Fairweather twins presented both opportunity and terrible risk. Under the doctor's observation, she would need to be more careful than ever before. But twins also meant complications, legitimate reasons why one or both might not survive. She found Temperance waiting by her cabin, the girl's face drawn with worry. I heard what they're planning, Temperance whispered. That doctor means to catch you. He's been asking questions in the quarters, offering rewards for information about your herbs and methods. Let him ask, Seraphina replied, though she made a mental note to move her most dangerous preparations to a new hiding place. The truth isn't always what appears on the surface. Why do you do it? Temperance asked suddenly, the question bursting from her as if she'd been holding it back for months. The white baby, why? Seraphina looked at the girl for a long moment, seeing Delilah's curiosity in her eyes, her courage in asking what others wouldn't dare voice. Every mother should know what it means to lose a child, she said finally. Every single one. That night she didn't sleep. Instead, she sat by her window watching Dr. Blackwood's shadow move in the guest house, his lamp burning until nearly dawn. He was reading, researching, and preparing, So was she, but her preparations were of a different sort. She ground herbs, by candlelight, mixed new combinations that might pass his chemical tests, practiced the precise movements that could end a life while appearing to save it. The harvest moon was coming, and with it, Magnolia Fairweather's twins. It would be the performance of her life, or the end of it. The tension is mounting as Dr. Blackwood closes in on Seraphina's deadly secret. Will she manage to fool his scientific scrutiny, or will the Fairweather birth expose her vengeful mission? Subscribe now and ring the notification bell to follow this dark tale of justice and revenge in the antebellum South. Drop a comment below. Do you think Seraphina should continue her mission despite the risks? The story grows darker from here. The harvest moon hung swollen and orange over Cypress Grove Plantation, casting long shadows across the manicured grounds as Seraphina arrived with her birthing bag. The Fairweather mansion stood 3 stories, tall, its white columns gleaming in the moonlight like bones. From an upper window came the sound of Magnolia Fairweather's labored breathing, punctuated by occasional cries that sent the mockingbirds fleeing from the magnolia trees. Dr. Blackwood was already there, of course. He had arrived hours earlier to prepare his observation station, transforming an adjoining room into a makeshift laboratory with his microscopes, chemical solutions, and endless notebooks. As Seraphina climbed the main staircase, she could smell the sharp scent of his carbolic acid solution. He insisted on sterilizing everything, a practice he'd learned from some European doctors' theories about invisible particles that caused disease. Augustus Fairweather met her at the top of the stairs, his usually florid face pale with worry. He was a larger man than Jeremiah Ashworth, with hands that had known manual labor before inheritance made him soft, and his gray eyes held a mixture of desperation and suspicion. "She's been laboring since noon," he said without preamble. "The pains are coming fast now. Dr. Blackwood says the babies are positioned well, but," he trailed off, glancing toward the room where his wife's cries were growing more urgent. "This is her 5th pregnancy, Seraphina. We've lost 3 already. If these twins don't survive—" "I'll do everything in my power, Master Fairweather," Seraphina said, keeping her voice steady and reassuring even as her mind calculated possibilities. Twins meant double the risk, double the opportunity, but also double the scrutiny under Dr. Blackwood's watchful eye. The birthing room was a study in contrasts, the elegant furniture pushed against the walls, the fine Persian rug rolled up and removed, replaced by practical sheets and towels. Magnolia Fairweather lay propped against a mountain of pillows, her auburn hair plastered to her skull, her nightgown soaked with perspiration. She was 38 years old, considered ancient for childbearing, and the strain showed in every line of her exhausted face. "Thank God you're here," she gasped, reaching out to grasp Seraphina's hand with surprising strength. "The doctor, he keeps examining me with those cold instruments, but he doesn't understand." "You understand, don't you? You've done this before." "Many times, mistress," Seraphina assured her, already assessing the situation with practiced eyes. The woman's color was poor, her pulse rapid and thready. The twins were indeed positioned well. She could feel them through the distended belly, but something else was wrong. There was a rigidity to the womb that suggested complications. Dr. Blackwood entered from his adjoining laboratory, wiping his hands on a pristine white cloth. His gold spectacles caught the lamplight as he observed Seraphina's examination. "What is your assessment?" he asked, as if they were colleagues rather than master and property. "The first baby is head down, ready to emerge," Seraphina reported. "The second is transverse, sideways, which will require turning after the first. Is delivered, but there's something else. The womb feels—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Wooden. Hard in a way that suggests the bleeding inside." "Placental abruption," Dr. Blackwood said immediately, his eyes sharpening with interest. "If you're correct, we have very little time. The babies must be delivered immediately, or all 3 will die." For a moment, Seraphina felt the universe offering her an unexpected gift. Placental abruption was often fatal to both mother and children, a legitimate medical emergency that could explain any number of deaths. But as she looked at Magnolia Fairweather's terrified face, something twisted in her chest. This woman had never been cruel to her slaves, had even allowed them small freedoms like Sunday gatherings and garden plots. More importantly, she had 3 living children who would be orphaned. "We need to act quickly," Seraphina said, pushing aside her moment of hesitation. "Mistress Fairweather, the babies must come now. You'll need to push with everything you have, even if the pains aren't telling you to." What followed was a battle between life and death that had nothing to do with Seraphina's dark mission. The first twin, a boy, emerged after 20 minutes of desperate pushing, his face purple but his lungs strong enough to announce his arrival with a piercing wail. Dr. Blackwood immediately took the infant, examining him with scientific thoroughness, while Seraphina worked to deliver the second child. The second twin was trapped, turned sideways as predicted, and Magnolia was weakening rapidly. Blood had begun to seep through the sheets, too much blood, and Seraphina knew she was watching a woman die. "I need to turn the baby," she announced, looking directly at Dr. Blackwood. "It will cause her tremendous pain, but it's the only chance." "Do it!" Augustus Fairweather commanded from the doorway, his voice breaking. "Whatever it takes." Seraphina reached inside, her skilled hands finding the baby's feet, slowly manipulating the tiny body into position. Magnolia screamed, a sound that would haunt even Seraphina's hardened dreams, but she didn't stop. 5 minutes later, the second twin emerged, another boy, smaller than his brother, silent and still. This was the moment. The child wasn't breathing, his skin tinged blue, his limbs limp. Everyone would expect him to die. Dr. Blackwood was occupied with the first twin. Augustus was at his wife's head, trying to keep her conscious. Seraphina held the power of life and death in her hands, literally. She could let him die. It would be so easy, so expected. One twin surviving from such a complicated birth would be considered a miracle. No one would question it, not even the suspicious doctor. But as she looked at the tiny form, something her grandmother once said echoed in her mind. "The spirits judge us not just by our actions, but by the choices we make when no one is watching." Hands moved without conscious thought, clearing the baby's airways, massaging his chest with precise pressure, breathing her own air into his tiny lungs. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th breath, he gasped, coughed, and began to cry. Weak at first, then stronger. "He's alive!" Augustus cried, tears streaming down his face. "Both of them are alive!" But Magnolia Fairweather was fading. The blood loss was too severe, her body too exhausted from the prolonged labor. Seraphina worked frantically, packing the bleeding with clean cloths, administering the herbs that might slow the hemorrhage. But she could see death settling over the woman's features like a veil. "The children," Magnolia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Let me see them." Augustus brought the twins to her, placing them against her chest. She smiled, an expression of perfect peace despite her agony, and kissed each tiny head. "Cassius and Prometheus," she said. "Those are their names, strong names. They'll need to be strong." She died as the sun began to rise, its light creeping through the windows to replace the harvest moon's orange glow. Augustus Fairweather collapsed beside the bed, his large frame shaking with sobs, while Dr. Blackwood efficiently checked the twins' vital signs and recorded his observations. "You saved them," the doctor said to Seraphina, and there was something like respect in his voice. "Your quick action, your skill. Without you, all 3 would have died." Seraphina said nothing, still staring at Magnolia's peaceful face. She had come here prepared to kill, and had planned every detail of how she would end these twins' lives under the doctor's very nose. Instead, she had fought to save them, and had used every skill her grandmother taught her to bring life rather than death. Why? Temperance asked her later after they had returned to Willowbrook. The girl had heard the news. Everyone had. The tragic death of Magnolia Fairweather and the miraculous survival of her twins was the talk of the county. You could have let them die. No one would have known. Seraphina was sitting in her cabin staring at her journal with its list of 5 names. She had been prepared to add 2 more, had mixed the herbs that would have done the job undetected. But faced with the actual moment, something had changed. I remembered what it was like, she said finally, when Delilah was born. How fierce that love was, how immediate. Magnolia Fairweather loved those boys the same way I loved my girl. She died for them. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. Maybe that's enough punishment. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Magnolia's death had been natural, tragic, but blameless. It wasn't the same as having your child ripped away, sold like cattle, worked to death in rice fields. The debt remained unpaid. Dr. Blackwood visited her cabin that evening, an unprecedented breach of social protocol that set the entire quarters buzzing with speculation. He stood in her doorway, having to duck his head to fit under the low frame, his pale eyes studying her sparse surroundings. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. I suspected you of the worst kind of crimes, but what I witnessed today, no one intending harm would have fought so hard to save those children. Seraphina remained seated on her stool, looking up at him with a carefully neutral expression. I do what I can, sir. God decides the rest. Yes, well, Dr. Blackwood adjusted his spectacles, clearly uncomfortable. I'll be returning to Columbia tomorrow. My report will state that the stillbirths appear to be a tragic coincidence, possibly related to environmental factors I'm still investigating. Your reputation should remain intact. After he left, Seraphina sat alone in the darkness for a long time. She had passed the test and had proven herself above suspicion. She was free to continue her work, to add more names to her journal, to balance the scales of justice as she saw fit. But something fundamental had shifted during those desperate hours at Cypress Grove. She had felt the weight of choice in her hands, not the choice between her life and theirs, but between becoming a monster or remaining human. Her grandmother had taught her about power, but she had also taught her about wisdom. Sometimes the greatest power was in choosing not to use it. A week later, she was called to attend another birth. A poor white family from the edge of the county, sharecroppers who could barely afford her fee. The woman was young, terrified, delivering her first child in a cabin not much better than the slave quarters. The baby was a girl, small but healthy, with a lusty cry that announced her determination to survive in this harsh world. As Seraphina placed the infant in her mother's arms, she made a decision. The journal with its 5 names would remain 5. The debt to Delilah would have to be paid in other ways, in lives saved rather than lives taken, in small acts of rebellion rather than grand gestures of revenge. But that night, when she returned to her cabin, she found a letter slipped under her door. It was written in an educated hand but unsigned. We know what you did. We know what you stopped doing. The choice you made at Cypress Grove has been noted. There are other ways to fight, other paths to justice. If you're interested, leave a white cloth in your window tomorrow night. Seraphina read the letter 3 times, then burned it in her candle flame. She didn't know who had sent it. It could be a trap, another test from Dr. Blackwood or the plantation owners. Or it could be something else, something she had heard whispered about in the quarters, a network of those who resisted in secret, who fought slavery with cunning rather than violence. She thought of Delilah, of the promise she had made to find her, to avenge her. Perhaps there were other children like Delilah who could still be saved, other mothers who could be spared that particular agony. Perhaps redemption lay not in evening the score, but in preventing future tragedies. The next night, a white cloth appeared in her window. The white cloth in Seraphina's window had been answered 3 nights later by a black feather left on her doorstep, a raven's feather, still glistening with oil. She knew it was a summons, though to what and where remained a mystery. That same morning, Temperance appeared at her cabin before dawn, her young face drawn with exhaustion and something else, fear mixed with determination. I found this, the girl said without preamble, producing a worn leather journal from beneath her apron. Hidden under your floorboard when I was looking for mouse holes to plug. They both knew she was lying about the mouse holes, but Seraphina felt ice forming in her veins as she recognized her own journal, the one with 5 names written in her careful script. She had moved it after Dr. Blackwood's warning, but apparently not well enough. "What you found," Seraphina said slowly, "could see us both hanged from the oak tree in the town square." "I know," Temperance replied, but instead of fear there was something else in her eyes. "My mama's name was Celestine. She died birthing my brother, but before that she knew things. She could read, though she hid it. She taught me letters in the dirt, then brushed them away. She told me that knowing things was dangerous, but not knowing was death." Seraphina studied the girl carefully. 15 years old, but aged beyond her years by slavery's weight. Smart enough to be dangerous, brave enough to be foolish. "What do you want?" Seraphina asked. "To understand," Temperance said. "The names. In your book, I recognize them. All stillbirths you attended, all white babies. But after the Fairweather twins, you stopped. Why?" Before Seraphina could answer, they heard footsteps approaching, heavy, measured steps that belonged to Hespera. The old cook entered without knocking, as was her way, her milky eyes somehow seeing everything despite their cloudiness. "Child," she said to Temperance, "you're needed at the big house. Mistress Ashworth is calling for you." Temperance hesitated, looking between the two older women, then handed the journal back to Seraphina and left. Hespera waited until her footsteps faded, then settled her considerable bulk onto Seraphina's single chair. "That girl is too curious for her own good," Hespera said. "Curiosity killed more than just cats in this place." "She found my journal," Seraphina admitted. There was no point in lying to Hespera. The old woman had ways of knowing things that defied explanation. "I know," Hespera replied, "just like I know what's written in it. Just like I know what you did to those babies, and what you didn't do to the Fairweather twins." Seraphina's hand moved instinctively toward the knife she kept, hidden in her skirts, but Hespera laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Child, if I meant you harm, you'd have been hanging from that oak months ago. I've known since the second one, the Pemberton baby. You used foxglove, didn't you? Just a drop on your finger, transferred to the baby's lips during the cleaning. Your grandmother's teaching, I expect." "How could you possibly?" "Because my grandmother taught me the same things," Hespera interrupted. "Different island, Barbados instead of Saint-Domingue. But the same knowledge, the same weight of knowing how to heal and harm." She reached into her apron and pulled out a small cloth bundle, unwrapping it to reveal dried leaves Seraphina didn't recognize. "This is bloodroot," Hespera explained, "from the Cherokee peoples who lived here before the white folks came. They traded it to my grandmother for fever medicine, a little help with coughs. A lot stops the heart, but leaves no trace. Cleaner than foxglove, harder to detect. Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're at a crossroads, child. That letter you got, yes, I know about that too. It's from people who call themselves the Railroad. Not the Freedom Railroad that takes our people north, but something else. Something that fights back in different ways." Hespera stood with difficulty, her joints protesting. "There's a meeting tonight, full midnight, at the old tobacco barn on the abandoned Crenshaw place. If you go, your life changes. If you don't, you keep your 5 names and your guilt, and maybe that's enough. Choose wisely." After the old woman left, Seraphina sat in the growing morning light, staring at her journal. 5 names, 5 small revenges that had seemed so important, so necessary. But what had they really accomplished? The white mothers grieved and moved on, had more babies, and continued their lives of privilege. The system that had killed Delilah remained unchanged. That afternoon, while working in her herb garden, she was surprised by a visitor, Cordelia Ashworth, still dressed in mourning black for her lost son. The mistress looked pale and drawn, her former beauty dimmed by grief, but there was something else in her eyes as she approached. "I need your help," Cordelia said without preamble, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I'm with child again." Seraphina's hand stilled on the rosemary she'd been cutting. "That's wonderful news, Mistress Ashworth." "Is it?" Cordelia's voice was bitter. "My husband thinks so. He needs an heir, he says. As if our son was just a failed attempt, something to be replaced." She moved closer, lowering her voice. I don't want this baby, Seraphina. I can't go through it again. The hope, the pain, the loss. I know you have ways. Herbs that can... Mistress, Seraphina said carefully. What you're asking? It's illegal, I know. Immoral, they'd say. But they don't understand what it's like, carrying death inside you for 9 months, wondering if this time will be different. Tears rolled down Cordelia's pale cheeks. Please, I know you have the knowledge. Everyone knows you learned things from your grandmother, things beyond simple midwifing. Here was an unexpected reversal. The white mistress begging the slave for forbidden knowledge, for the power to choose her own fate. Seraphina thought of the bloodroot Hespera had shown her, of the other herbs that could end a pregnancy safely, in the early months. I can help you, she said finally. But not here. Too many eyes. There's an old barn on the abandoned Crenshaw place. Meet me there at sunset, alone. Cordelia nodded eagerly, pressing a small leather purse into Seraphina's hands. Thank you, thank you. As the sun set that evening, Seraphina made her way through the pine forest to the Crenshaw place, a plantation abandoned 10 years ago when the family died of yellow fever. The old tobacco barn stood like a skeleton against the darkening sky. Its boards weathered silver by time and neglect. Cordelia was already there, pacing nervously in the shadows. But she wasn't alone. As Seraphina approached, figures emerged from the darkness. Hespera, Temperance, and 3 people she didn't recognize. A tall man with ritual scars on his cheeks, a woman in field hand clothes with intelligent eyes, and, surprisingly, a white man in simple farmer's clothing. What is this? Cordelia gasped, starting to back away. The crossroads Hespera mentioned, the scarred man said, his voice carrying an African accent Seraphina hadn't heard since childhood. My name is Tobias. I represent those who resist in shadow rather than daylight. I don't understand, Cordelia said, but the woman in field clothes stepped forward. You asked for herbs to end your pregnancy, she said. We can provide them. But we ask something in return, information. Your husband meets with other planters, discusses business, politics. We need to know what they're planning. You're asking me to spy on my own husband? We're asking you to choose, Tobias said, between the system that killed your baby. Oh yes, we know the truth of that, and the possibility of change. Cordelia's eyes widened as she turned to Seraphina. You killed my son? Yes, Seraphina said simply. There was no point. In denial now. And 4 others, because your people killed my daughter. The white farmer stepped forward before Cordelia could respond. My name is Elijah Thornwood, he said. I owned slaves once. I inherited them from my father. One day I watched my overseer whip a child for spilling water, a child no older than my own son. That night I freed them all and joined this cause. You're abolitionists, Cordelia breathed. We're more than that, Tobias replied. We're a network. Some help slaves escape north. Others gather information. Some, like Seraphina here, are positioned to influence events in other ways. The question is, will you join us? Cordelia stood frozen, her world reshaping itself around her. Finally, she asked, and if I refuse? Then you leave here with the herbs you came for and never speak of this, the field woman said. But you'll always wonder what might have been different if you'd chosen courage over comfort. My son, Cordelia said to Seraphina, her voice breaking. Did he suffer? No, Seraphina replied. And for once it was the truth. It was instant, like falling asleep. Cordelia closed her eyes, swaying slightly. When she opened them, there was something new there, not forgiveness perhaps, but understanding. I'll do it, she said. I'll gather information. But I want something more than just the herbs. I want to know why. Why my baby? What had he done? Nothing, Seraphina said. Just like my Delilah had done nothing. That's the horror of it all. Innocents paying for the sins of systems they didn't create. The meeting continued for another hour, plans being made, codes established, roles assigned. Seraphina learned that the network was vast, stretching from Virginia to Florida, with members in the most unexpected places. Judges who dismissed runaway, cases on technicalities. Doctors who declared slaves too sick to work when they were healthy. Mistresses who taught their slaves to read in secret. As they prepared to leave, Temperance approached Seraphina. "I want to learn," she said. "Everything you know. The healing and the harming, the herbs and the ways. Will you teach me?" Seraphina looked at the girl, so young, so eager to carry dangerous knowledge. "Why?" "Because knowledge is power," Temperance replied. "And power is the only thing that can change this world." That night, Seraphina burned her journal with its 5 names. The past was done. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but full of possibility. She thought of Delilah, wondering what her daughter would think of this new path. Would she approve of her mother choosing subterfuge over vengeance, collaboration over isolation? A screech owl called 3 times in the darkness, the same omen from the night of Cordelia's stillbirth. But now Seraphina understood it differently. Not an omen of death, but of transformation. The owl, after all, was a predator that hunted, in darkness, seeing what others couldn't. The next morning brought news that would shake Colleton County to its foundations. Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood had been found dead in his Columbia laboratory, apparently poisoned by his own experimental chemicals. The authorities ruled it an accident. The brilliant doctor had been known for taking risks in his research. But a certain dried leaf found in his tea would have told a different story, if anyone had known to look for bloodroot. Hespera brought Seraphina the news with her morning coffee, her cloudy eyes revealing nothing. "Seems the good doctor's research into stillbirths has died with him," the old cook said casually. "Shame. He was so close to understanding things." "Indeed," Seraphina replied, equally casual, "though perhaps some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue." "Perhaps," Hespera agreed, then added quietly, "The railroad sends its thanks for your decision at Cypress Grove. Saving those twins proved you could choose mercy over vengeance. That's the kind of person they need." As Hespera left, Seraphina reflected on the strange turns her path had taken. She had begun with a list of names to kill and ended with a network dedicated to liberation. The debt to Delilah remained, would always remain, but perhaps it could be paid in freedom rather than blood. The story takes a dramatic turn as Seraphina joins a resistance network and discovers she's not alone in her fight. But with Dr. Blackwood dead and new alliances forming, what dangers lie ahead? Make sure you're subscribed to see how this tale of rebellion and redemption unfolds. Comment below. Do you think Cordelia can be trusted, or will she betray the network? The final chapter promises even more shocking revelations. October arrived with unseasonable cold, frost silvering the cotton fields of Willowbrook Plantation like premature age. 6 weeks had passed since the meeting in the abandoned barn, 6 weeks during which Seraphina had lived a double life more complex than her previous deception. By day, she tended to the sick and pregnant, her reputation as a midwife intact despite the whispered suspicions that had never quite died. By night, she taught Temperance the ancient knowledge, prepared packets of herbs for the railroad, and received coded messages through Cordelia Ashworth. The summons came on a Thursday morning, delivered by Jeremiah Ashworth himself as he made his rounds of the quarters. He found Seraphina tending to an elderly field hand's infected wound, her hands gentle despite the man's delirium. "You're needed at the house," he said brusquely, his bloodshot eyes avoiding direct contact with hers. The bourbon was taking its toll earlier each day now, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured. "Cordelia's time has come." Seraphina's blood chilled. Cordelia wasn't supposed to be pregnant. She had taken the herbs and had confirmed their success. Unless— "I'll come immediately, Master Ashworth," she said, her mind already racing through possibilities. The walk to the main house felt like a march to the gallows. Had Cordelia betrayed them? Has the network been exposed? Or was this something else? Entirely another test from forces she didn't yet understand? She found Cordelia in her bedroom, not in labor, but sitting fully dressed in her vanity, her face composed, but her eyes burning with something Seraphina couldn't quite read. Beside her stood a woman Seraphina had never seen before, elderly, well-dressed with the bearing of old Southern aristocracy. "Close the door," Cordelia commanded, and Seraphina obeyed, noting that Jeremiah was nowhere to be seen. "This is my Aunt Theodora Blackwood," Cordelia said, and Seraphina's heart nearly stopped. "Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood's sister." The elderly woman studied Seraphina with eyes as sharp and cold as her late brother's had been. "I know what you did," she said without preamble. "All of it. The babies you murdered, the network you've joined, the role you played in my brother's death." Seraphina stood perfectly still, calculating distances to the door, the window, the letter opener on Cordelia's vanity that could serve as a weapon if needed. "I should clarify," Theodora continued, a thin smile creasing her weathered face. "I know and I approve." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Seraphina looked between the two white women, searching for the trap. "My brother was brilliant," Theodora said, settling into a chair with obvious difficulty. "But he was also a monster. His research into racial characteristics, his experiments, I've read his private journals. What he did to enslaved women and children in the name of science would horrify even the most hardened slaveholder." She reached into her bag and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This details his experiments at a plantation in Mississippi before he came to South Carolina. Deliberate infection with diseases to test racial immunity theories. Surgical procedures without anesthesia to study pain responses. Children. Seraphina." "He experimented on children?" Seraphina felt sick, but also vindicated. She had sensed something, evil in Dr. Blackwood beyond mere prejudice, something that made even her acts of vengeance seem mild by comparison. "He was close to exposing you," Cordelia added. "He'd written to colleagues in Europe about his suspicions and was planning to have you arrested and dissected. Yes, dissected, to understand what he called the savage mind." Aunt Theodora intercepted those letters. "Why?" Seraphina asked, finding her voice at last. "Why would you protect me?" Theodora's expression darkened. "Because 40 years ago I had a daughter, Charlotte. She was beautiful, willful, and in love with a young man her father didn't approve of. When she became pregnant out of wedlock, my husband sent her to my brother for medical assistance. She died on his table, along with her baby. He called it a tragic complication, but I knew better. He killed her because she had violated his ideas about racial purity. The father was Italian, you see, not quite white enough for the Blackwood family." The room fell silent, 3 women bound by losses that transcended the boundaries society had built between them. "We have a proposition," Cordelia said finally. "Aunt Theodora has connections throughout the South, judges, senators, even advisors to President Pierce. The railroad needs that kind of access. In exchange, we need someone to disappear." "Who?" Seraphina asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Jeremiah," Cordelia said flatly. "My husband. He's planning something terrible. He's been corresponding with other planters about forming a militia to hunt escaped slaves into northern states. They call themselves the Brotherhood of Blood. They plan to start a war if necessary to preserve slavery. You want me to kill your husband?" "No," Theodora interjected. "Death would make him a martyr. We need him discredited, ruined, driven mad, if necessary, and we believe you have the knowledge to accomplish that." Seraphina thought of the herbs she knew, the ones that could alter the mind rather than stop the heart. Jimson weed that caused hallucinations, ergot that induced madness, belladonna that blurred the line between dream and nightmare. "It would take time," she said slowly. "Small doses over weeks or months, and someone would need to administer them, daily." "Leave that to me," Cordelia said with grim satisfaction. "I've been putting things in his bourbon for weeks now, just harmless herbs from your garden. He never notices." "Why?" Seraphina asked. "He's your husband, the father of your—" She trailed off, remembering. "The father of the child you killed," Cordelia finished. Yes, and at first I hated you for it. But then I realized something. You gave my son a mercy, keeping him from growing up to become his father. Jeremiah has 3 bastard children in the quarters. Did you know that? 3 children he's never acknowledged, who he'll sell without hesitation when they're old enough. My son would have grown up to be the same kind of monster. Over the next hour, they planned Jeremiah Ashworth's downfall with the precision of generals planning a campaign. Small doses of carefully selected herbs would gradually erode his sanity. Cordelia would document his deterioration in letters to concerned relatives. Theodora would ensure those letters reached the right people. Within 6 months, Jeremiah would be committed to an asylum, his plantation sold, his slaves scattered to the wind, but scattered according to the railroad's design, to places where freedom might be possible. As Seraphina prepared to leave, Theodora handed her a daguerreotype, a photograph, still a rare and expensive novelty. It showed a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes. Charlotte, Theodora said. My daughter. She would have been 43 now. Might have had children, of her own. Every child you save, every family you keep together honors her memory. That night, Seraphina prepared the first batch of what would become Jeremiah Ashworth's medicine. A careful blend of herbs that would seem to treat his drinking problem while slowly dismantling his grip on reality. As she worked, Temperance assisted, learning the precise measurements, the proper extraction methods, the art of hiding poison in plain sight. Is this justice? The girl asked, holding a vial of tincture up to the candlelight. No, Seraphina replied honestly. Justice would be Delilah alive and free. This is just survival, and maybe a chance for others to have what she couldn't, eh? Month later, the first signs appeared. Jeremiah began seeing shadows that weren't there, hearing voices in empty rooms. He accused slaves of plotting against him, then forgot his accusations minutes later. He would fly into rages over imagined slights, then weep like a child for reasons he couldn't articulate. 2 months in, he held a dinner party that became the talk of Colleton County. In front of 12 guests, he insisted that the roasted peacock on the table was speaking to him, warning him of a slave uprising. He pulled a pistol and shot the bird repeatedly, spraying gravy and stuffing across his horrified guests. 3 months in, he became convinced that his deceased father was living, in the walls watching him, judging him. He tore apart entire rooms searching for hidden passages, destroying family heirlooms and valuable furniture in his frenzy. Through it all, Cordelia played the devoted wife, documenting everything, writing tearful letters to relatives about her husband's decline. Theodora ensured those letters reached influential people, along with doctors' reports, written by physicians sympathetic to the cause, recommending immediate institutionalization. The end came in February 1856, almost exactly a year after Seraphina had begun her dark work. Jeremiah Ashworth was found in the cotton fields at dawn, naked and screaming, claiming that the plants were his children and someone was trying to harvest them. The sheriff, accompanied by 2 doctors and a judge, all railroad members though they didn't know each other as such, declared him incompetent. He was taken to the state asylum in Columbia, where he would spend his remaining years insisting that his slaves had poisoned him, a claim dismissed as the ravings of a madman. Cordelia, as his nearest relative, took control of the plantation. Her first act was to hire Elijah Thornwood, the white farmer from the railroad, as her new overseer. Her second was to begin gradually freeing slaves, claiming economic necessity, while actually sending them north through underground railroad routes. The night before, Seraphina was to leave Willowbrook. Cordelia had arranged for her to be sold to a sympathetic family in Maryland, from where she could easily escape to Pennsylvania. She visited the small cemetery where the plantation's slaves were buried. She found the unmarked grave she was looking for, the one Hesper had shown her months ago. "This is where we buried the babies," the old cook had said. "The ones who died naturally, and the others. We couldn't tell them apart after a while, so we buried them together. Seemed fitting somehow." Seraphina knelt beside the grave, pressing her hands into the cold earth. 5 white babies lay here, victims of her vengeance. But how many black babies lay in unmarked graves across the South? How many Delilahs? "I'm sorry," she whispered, not sure if she was apologizing to the dead infants or to her daughter for not saving her. "I'm sorry for all of it." "Don't be," a voice said behind her. She turned to find Temperance, no longer the frightened girl. She'd been a year ago, but a young woman ready to take up the work. "You did what you had to do, we all do." "Will you continue?" Seraphina asked. "The healing, the knowledge, the resistance?" "Yes," Temperance replied without hesitation, "but differently. I'll save who I can, help who needs it, and fight in whatever way works. Not for vengeance, but for the future." The next morning, Seraphina left Willowbrook for the last time, carried in a wagon toward what she hoped would be freedom. She carried little with her: some herbs, her grandmother's teachings, the daguerreotype of Charlotte Blackwood that Theodora had insisted she keep. The journal with its 5 names had long since turned to ash, but the names themselves were carved into her memory, eternal reminders of how grief could transform into rage, rage into action, and action into something larger than individual vengeance. As the wagon rolled through the gates, she saw Cordelia watching from an upstairs window. Their eyes met for a moment. Murderer and accomplice, victim and ally, 2 women who had found common ground in the most unlikely circumstances. Cordelia raised her hand slightly, a gesture that might have been farewell or blessing or simple acknowledgement of what they'd shared. The road stretched ahead, dusty and uncertain. Somewhere to the north lay Pennsylvania and freedom. Somewhere beyond that lay a future where children like Delilah might live to grow old. It seemed impossible, a dream too fragile to survive the harsh light of reality. But then Seraphina thought of the network she was leaving behind: Temperance with her growing knowledge, Cordelia with her newfound purpose, Theodora with her connections, Hespera with her ancient wisdom, and countless others whose names she'd never know. Each one a thread in a growing web of resistance, each thread strengthening the others. She thought of Dr. Blackwood's research into racial characteristics, his attempt to prove scientifically what slavery had always claimed, that some people were born to be property. He had died believing in that lie, poisoned by the very people he considered inferior. There was a poetry in that, a justice more complete than anything Seraphina could have planned. The wagon rolled on, carrying her toward whatever came next. Behind her, the sun rose over Willowbrook Plantation, where the cotton still grew and slaves still labored, but where something fundamental had changed. The seeds of destruction had been planted, watered with madness and tended by unexpected hands. Seraphina closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for a moment, that Delilah was waiting for her somewhere up north. Not the 7-year-old who'd been taken, but the young woman she might have become. Strong, free, alive. It was a fantasy, she knew, but sometimes fantasies were all that kept people moving forward. "Find your way to freedom, Mama," she whispered to herself in Delilah's imagined voice, "and then help others find theirs." The wagon wheels turned, carrying her away from one life and toward another, from a past written in blood toward a future that remained unwritten. Behind her, the South continued its slow dance toward war, unaware that its foundation had already been undermined by the very people it considered property. And in the small cemetery at Willowbrook, 5 small graves lay undisturbed, their occupants neither judged nor forgotten, simply part of the terrible arithmetic of slavery, a system that turned everyone it touched into either victim or perpetrator, and sometimes both. The story of Seraphina Moss ended there, on that dusty road in February 1856. But the story of the railroad, of Temperance, of Cordelia's transformation, of all the small rebellions that would eventually bring down the peculiar institution, those stories were just beginning. This concludes our dark tale of vengeance and redemption in the antebellum South. Seraphina's journey from isolated revenge to collective resistance reminds us that even in history's darkest chapters, people found ways to fight back, to preserve their humanity, and to plant seeds of change. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with others who appreciate historical fiction that doesn't shy away from difficult truths. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Was Seraphina justified in her actions? Can vengeance ever lead to justice? And remember, the real heroes of this era were the countless enslaved people who resisted in ways big and small, whose names we'll never know, but whose courage changed the world. Thank you for joining me on this haunting journey through one of America's most troubled periods.